Good morning. We are so delighted that you have decided to step in to this time with us. We are going to talk, as we have been doing, about missions, and we hope that you stay with us, that you make yourself comfortable as we journey together for the next 49 minutes, and we chat about how to get to those people who are in your immediate circle, those people that need to hear or have revealed the reality of the gospel in their lives. So, two things we pray that happen as we converse. One, that God puts in your mind's eye people for whom this information would be beneficial. But secondly, probably more important, that God gives you a clear conception of what the gospel is. Because let's face it, we cannot take people to where we haven't gone. So we're going to have a conversation as we do every weekend. Before we do that, we're going to start with a word of prayer. God, we want to thank you so much for being the God that moves and breathes. And we want to thank you because there are some connections that we can find with the culture, with the world, with the ideas, and that we come in contact with. And perhaps the invitation today isn't to burn down the institutions that comprise the frameworks of the mind and the ideologies that are prevalent. Perhaps the invitation is to find connections so that we can enter into a dialogue with a world that desperately needs to hear the gospel. So we want to pray that you give us sensitivity and that you give us that ability. We want to pray in your name. Amen. Friends, as always, I have my co-host here, Joey O. Joey, welcome.
Thank you. So good to be here after a little time off. The children's program was amazing, but it's also good to be back here discussing with you again.
It's an amazing program, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I hope you all enjoyed it.
Yeah.
We had just so much fun watching our kiddos sing.
And your son Micah, he did a great job.
He gets his acting chops from his mother, and he loved it. So it's good. We've got another play here coming in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
The musical that is being put by the media, and Micah's very excited because they have been practicing long and hard. He said, "Dad, it's really going to ramp up because this week is Tech Week," and I didn't know what that was. Apparently our media friends, Edwin, who's one of our producers, is also in the play, so he will be in front of the camera.
Wow.
And Tech Week apparently is when all the gear comes in, and so now you're doing rehearsals with gear and lights and mics and everything. So they've really been working hard. It's going to be a fantastic musical, not because Micah's in it, but because it's all been produced written, produced, scored by people on our team, which should just. It's amazing. One of our media crew members, another producer, Summer, wrote some of the scores and some of the songs for the play. Our very talented colleague Adriana composed some of the music for the play. Scotty Ray, another one of our media volunteers, doing some amazing work. Scotty is a Harvard-trained actor, and that really shows. And then we've got people who, like Edwin, who love being here so much that they say, not only do I work here, I want to spend my time in church. And so they're leaving every night around 10 p.m.
I know. I was here for a meeting late at night, and they said, okay, we need to let the kids go at 9 o'clock, but then the adults stayed longer to continue to rehearse.
Yeah.
I mean, really, truly amazing. Amazing, partially because Micah's in it, but also because of all the things that you highlighted.
So much.
Oh, my goodness. So if you want to watch this, it's called Light of Love. You can get tickets. They're still available on our website, LLUC.org. If you're in the area, please drop by. I know my family, we invited our friends to one of the showings. There's several showings over the next couple weeks, and so we're very excited about it.
We're thrilled about it. We've got people coming from all over the state because it's a great play. Not only is it charming music, but it's funny and it's heartwarming. So LLUC.org. Click on events, you'll see it, as my colleague mentioned, and get some tickets. There's several showings, and we'll see you there.
Yeah, and the Christmas candlelight concert is this, tonight.
Tonight.
Yeah, and if you haven't gotten your tickets yet, unfortunately, they seem pretty much sold out. But it's always an amazing concert, and they do sometimes like to show it eventually later on. As our gift to the community, they'll broadcast it around Christmas time.
Yes.
So look, if you're not able to come in person, you haven't been able to get a ticket, look forward to that, because our musicians always do an amazing job.
Yeah, did you get your tickets?
I did. I did very early because
early. They run out. They run out.
Yeah.
They run out, and we were just debating, and then Micah's like, "You're not going to come see me sing," and I said, we are at that stage where my son's life is more exciting than mine. So. But yes, come. We'll see you tonight. To those of you who have tickets and are in the area, 4:00, we'll see you tonight. The rest of you, as Joey said, we always broadcast it later to kind of give the Christmas season an extra oomph. So to those of you who will be viewing that later, we hope you enjoy it. So much stuff going around. We had the play last week. We've got this other play coming up. We've got Christmas Candlelight Concert. We're in the middle of our Advent series, and we're seeing our wonderful families actually light the Advent candle. It is a busy time.
Yeah, it's always a fun time too. It just feels, this is the season where it feels like Christmas, and we get reminded of the reason for the season, which is the birth of Jesus, the gift that God gave us of the incarnation, which is central to everything about who we are and what we do. So, yeah.
And in the midst of a season of ribbons and wrapping paper, we get a lesson that talks about how to reach out to the unreached. Didn't love the title of the lesson, but and it doesn't seem, mainly because it doesn't seem to coincide with everything that else that is going on.
Yeah.
At least at first reading, I cannot imagine anything less Christmassy than a philosophical convention at the Areopagus, and yet that is where the lesson takes us this week.
Yeah, and some interesting lessons that come out of this. Paul really operating outside of his usual way of operating, and I'm looking forward to discussing this with you.
So Acts chapter 17, right? And as you said, there are some principles that appear. I love just the mental image that Luke starts to paint. And Luke, as we know, fantastic storyteller, tells us probably the best known story in Christmas, and yet here he is again at his storytelling charm. You have Paul moving around Athens, surrounded by statues of idols, and he is distressed. And Luke uses the same word that he uses to refer not to Paul, but to Saul, as he is distressed upon hearing the testimony of Stephen. And you have the images, right? Those images kind of juxtaposed. This anger that he felt, and now this distress that he feels as they move among the rocks. And the question is, what will Paul do? Will he chisel out a piece of marble or rock from those idols to throw them at someone and to stone them? Or has Jesus done something different in his life? So just the way Luke has set up this story is masterful.
Oh, that is so beautiful. Yeah. I love the contrast that you point out between this story and what happened before he started following Jesus, and how perhaps his reactions and responses to his distress, even though the distress may have been a similar feeling, his response is a little bit different this time around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the lesson, I think, does a great job at kind of cautioning when we're feeling this distress that you're talking about, cautioning against following the path of least resistance. So Paul starts in the synagogue, then moves across the aisle, as it were, the ideological aisle, and speaks to the God-fearing Gentiles, those that are called in the scriptures the proselytes. But he doesn't end there. For on Areopagus, there's Epicureans and Stoics arguing. And don't worry, we're going to unpack what that means in a bit. And that's where he ends up. And so it's really interesting how Paul moves. You kind of see, again, a microcosm of the gospel as the Christ's command to make disciples in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the end of the world is kind of, you have a snapshot here. The synagogue, God-fearing Gentiles, Stoics and Epicureans.
Yeah, I love the progression and that seems to be his regular pattern that he follows, right? He always starts at the synagogues, and then he reaches the God-fearing Greeks, and then he reaches out to the larger community. But what is also fascinating is the emotional distress that he experiences as he moves, right? As he enters this world that becomes more and more foreign to his way of thinking and his way of approaching life, right? As he moves from the synagogue out into the marketplace, that distress increases because he looks at these idols. And it's hard for me as a 21st century Christian to really grasp the utter distress that a Jew would have felt walking among these idols and these temples built to other gods, right? Because idols hold very little meaning for me now, and there are very few people in the United States who worship at least these kinds of stone statues as idols, right? We can talk a little bit about idolatry a little bit more later, but these stone structures as idols, it doesn't bother me to think of, oh, these statues, they're just interesting art pieces to me. Like I visited Athens and I've walked through there, and I took a picture of Nike, right? And it was an interesting statue. I was like, oh, that's great art that they've created. But for him, as a Jew, that was deeply disturbing. This was deeply disturbing. And I try to connect that. What would be as disturbing for me as a 21st century Christian? Where would I have to walk in order to experience the same kind of distress that Paul experienced at that time? And I mean, what would it be? Would it be like the red light district of a city? Like what would it be that the world would feel like it's so foreign, and not just so foreign, but so anti everything that I believed in, right? What spaces would I have to trod to experience that? Because that seems to be what Paul is experiencing here.
What I find fascinating isn't just the fact that he is trotting in unfamiliar spaces and in unfamiliar places. What I find fascinating is the spirit that, because there's this kind of dueling emotions that the text brings up. There's distress and there's reason. And if distress leads to rage, you have the stoning of Stephen. If distress leads to a rational approach to the gospel, it leads to finding points of connection in unfamiliar places and unfamiliar spaces. So with that in mind, think a little bit about what he finds at the Areopagus. Now, you are right, and I think we've all heard of of the debauchery and the excess of the Roman Empire. But to think that Rome was completely amoral is to miss the delicate conversations that are occurring as they do in any society.
Yeah.
Conversations on ethics and morality and what is right and what is proper. What I find interesting is that Paul links up with people with whom he has very little in common with, except their conceptions of morality connect. So who are these Epicureans and Stoics? Well, Epicureans saw themselves as a response to Neoplatonic thought. Plato, who was a wonderful thinker that believed, both Plato and Aristotle believed that there was one ultimate God, but that God could be reflected in many ways, and that the forms, not unlike what you said, were interesting art pieces, but in of themselves had absolutely no power. For both Plato and Aristotle, then, the whole purpose of life was to experience the right amount of both pleasure and pain in the right amount of circumstances. So there were some circumstances that required and demanded pain, and you needed to feel that. There were other circumstances that demanded pleasure, and you needed to be open to them. So by no means hedonism. Epicureans come up and say, yes, that is true, but one of the problems of Neoplatonic thought is with all of its talk about a God up there somewhere in the perfect realms of form, what we've created is a lot of people who are afraid of that God. So the real purpose of life is pleasure. Now, a lot of people that haven't actually delved into reading Epicurus say, well, these are hedonists that are just looking to please themselves. Epicureans believed in a disciplined life because they believed that excess led to pain and suffering. And so it was all about living the disciplined life for life's sake, not because you were going to get a reward at some point in the future, or because you were going to placate some God. It was live a life that is disciplined and ethical for disciplines, for life's sake, and have pleasure. Very similar, I might add, to the advice that the wise and the sage writers of Israel give in the Old Testament, right? Then come the Stoics. So the Stoics and the Epicureans are debating because the Stoics believed that you needed to have a God, but that God was wholly other. Again, very similar language to some of the language we use now in Christian parlance, and that wholly other God was devoid of any pathos, devoid of any emotion. So the point and the purpose of life was to eliminate passion and pathos as much as you could in order to reflect God. And so the big debate that was occurring between the Stoics and the Epicureans is passion or no passion. And in comes Paul saying, guess what? God is both.
I love how you frame that, because yes, there is a temptation to look at Epicureans and think that, oh, they are hedonists. All they wanted was pleasure. But their concept of pleasure is so fascinating. Like tranquility was the ultimate pleasure. And when I think about pleasure, I don't think of tranquility. That's not one of the words that popped into my mind. And yet for them, that was the ultimate pleasure, is having that sense of peace and tranquility and that sense of good and eliminating all of the disturbing fears from our lives. So all of that, there are connections between both the Old Testament and New Testament messages and the Epicureans, and also, like you talked about with the Stoics, this idea of discipline and duty, and then I hadn't thought about it this way, but I loved how you brought Paul bringing both of these concepts and saying that it's both of these, bringing it together. And what's fascinating for me is his ability to do that, his willingness to do that, right? Because as you pointed out, when he encountered something disturbing the last time with Stephen, his thing was to get rid of it, was just to break it down and to throw stones. And yet here, instead of throwing stones, he tries to find common ground with these two philosophies that were, to a certain extent, disturbing to him, but he was still willing to try to find that common ground, that common meeting point instead.
Yeah, and look at how he does it, right? Text says that he begins preaching the story of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. And that would immediately have perked and piqued the interest of both of these a group of people that are arguing on Oropagus. On the one hand, you would have had people saying, yeah, absolutely, there's a God. What are you kidding me? Yes, there's a God, and there is a point to live a ethic that is stemming from deontology, from this rule-based approach. And then Paul would have said, yeah, but guess what? That God is human and died. And immediately the Stoics would have said, no, no, no. And he died to make you one, and to make this animosity that existed between humanity and divinity. God died in order to resolve that problem so that you wouldn't be afraid anymore. And so the Epicureans would have said, well, we can get on board with that. And so there's this really interesting capacity that Paul has, not only to begin by having a clear, concise understanding of what he's trying to teach, but probably the most important part, as he is invited to enter into this marketplace of ideas, is that he understands the language and the ideological framework of his audience. And I think often when it comes to us entering and interacting with the world of ideas, we don't understand the language and the ideological framework that our audience has.
Yeah, that's such an important point, because sometimes we feel like because we know the truth or know what is right or know what is real, that it is our place to walk into those spaces and just sort of lecture people and let them know. And they either follow us or we don't. And yet what Paul is showing here is that for him, that first step happened even before he stepped into those spaces. He took time to understand their framework, their language, the ways that they communicate, the struggles that they had, and the things that they took pride in. He took time to understand them. And then he didn't use those things just as against them. He used them to find common ground with them. But then he also led them to something more, right? So, but it started with empathy and understanding and moving towards common ground, and then moving on to something more after.
And I think, and what does the question then is, and I know that this is the question that we often struggle with, what does empathy and understanding look like? Because we all love to use this terminology. We are in a world that promotes political correctness while also banning, eliminating, and canceling those with whom we disagree. And so we want to raise up the banner of understanding and inclusivism and ecumenism, and yet we have very little bandwidth for people with whom we disagree. And so the question becomes, well, what does this empathy and understanding look like? And Paul gives us, I think, the perfect case study in this chapter. He starts by saying, people of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. Now, that seems like a turn of phrase that ought to be interesting, because as Luke begins writing this chapter, he says Paul is distressed by all the idols that he sees. And yet it is that same thing that is causing him distress that now by the time we get to verse 22, he is commending the people of Athens for. People of Athens, I came to your city. I was extremely distressed because you have all these idols or temples. By the way, congratulations, because I see you're really religious.
Yeah, that compliment is really interesting because, like you said, it comes after the distress. It also comes after them sort of mocking him, right? In verse 18, some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? You know, so these people are actively hostile to Paul, and yet his response, again, is not to attack, is not to use violence or not to use force, but instead to seek to build common ground by, of all things, complementing their religion, which, I don't know, as a Jew, that must, as a trained Jew, a Pharisee, that must have run so counter to the very core of how he had grown up. And yet he is able to do that. He's able to do that here because he sees something greater than just drawing a line in the sand there.
And he's able to do that because as he draws that line in the sand, he is being introspective. And I think that is the important part. And you started hinting at that. we often say we have the truth. And what that really means, or possessing the truth, I should say, often, hopefully not in this particular community, but often saying I have the truth is a perfect pretext for laziness. We say I have the truth, therefore there is nothing left for me to learn.
Wow.
And when we encounter a viewpoint that differs from us, that makes us uncomfortable, and so we dismiss it. It seems like what Paul is doing in chapter 17 is he is asking the question of, and he is experiencing the process of introspection. These idols are causing me distress. So I have an opportunity, and every bone in my Pharisaically trained body is saying run. And yet in verse 22 and 23, he says, I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship. What are these objects of worship? The same idols that are causing him distress, right? So he is saying, look, before I'm ready to speak to you, I've engaged in the process of introspection by which I stare into that thing that causes me distress or makes me angry, because my primary interest isn't to have or to hoard the truth. It is to be understood. And that only happens through introspection.
Yeah. And that understanding when it's genuine, not when it's just, I'm pretending to listen to you so that you'll listen to me when I talk, right? When it's actually genuine, when we are seeking to truly understand where they're coming from and what their viewpoint on, that is so powerful. It's a powerful connecting moment between people. I remember reading a book by Chris Voss. I'll never split the difference. He's a former FBI hostage negotiator. And he talks about the power of empathy in hostage negotiation. And I found that he calls it tactical empathy. But his point is that relationship between the person that you're negotiating with and you is so important that he actually, even though this is a person that has done a terrible thing, that in order to be able to converse and negotiate effectively, that he has to, in his own mind and in the other person's mind, see themselves as partners in the conversation rather than opponents. And what that means is that I have to really understand where you're coming from in order to partner with you. And he sees that as the first step to effective negotiation. And this is as hostile as it gets, right? Like they're holding hostages that they are threatening to kill. You have to get every single one of them out. You can't, that's why he calls it never split the difference. You can't split the difference and say, okay, I'm only gonna save 5, but you can kill 5, right? He has to get them all out. And yet, even in that kind of adversarial relationship, that's set up as an adversarial relationship, he sees the power of the connection of empathy in getting through this. And I found that so fascinating. And yet, when it comes to something where we are genuine partners, when we're talking to someone that we are trying to help them to experience something amazing that we've also experienced, right? Our intent is for their good. That sometimes, even in those kinds of contexts, we approach it as an adversarial relationship rather than a partnership. And what Paul seems to be showing here is actually what's more effective is when we come alongside people as partners in this journey, rather than opponents that I need to like beat down and convince you by shattering all of your arguments. We actually, it's more effective when we journey this road together. And maybe in journeying this road with you, I learn and I grow as well.
Absolutely. That's the hope, right? Because true partnership implies that you have something to contribute to the conversation. It's interesting that Luke doesn't put Paul in the Parthenon. And so you've been to Athens. You know how close the Areopagus is to the Parthenon. They're basically now, if you go, it's the same exact complex, but they're not the same thing. The Parthenon is where the crowd would gather. And this isn't where Paul is talking. Now, the crowd, the people that enjoy the spectacles in the arena and the games, they believe that there's many gods. The Stoics, the Neoplatonists, the Epicureans, they think that all that is hogwash. The one thing that all these people can agree on isn't their ethics, but it is their idea that religion is a tool employed by the empire to control people. And so notice how Paul then moves. He says, the God who made the world and the heavens, for all of them, it is this creator that lives in the perfect realm of form, does not live in temples built by hands. And immediately everybody says, absolutely, we can agree with that. Absolutely, we can sign off on that. And he is not served by human hands. And so it is really, really important that as you're partnering, you have the correct understanding of what a partnership is. And a partnership ultimately involves the exchange of information, of viewpoints, of ideas, and of resources in order for us both to grow. And when we do that, what is really fascinating is that these differences that we thought were unsurmountable begin to crumble. And you realize that you have more in common with other people than what you might have thought at first.
Wow, that's so powerful. And you may wonder, like, how is Paul how do we see Paul developing and growing through this experience? Well, we see that in that there are the way that Paul approaches this conversation is so different than his other sermons and his other messages, right? Like what you talk about, he is incorporating philosophy that they would understand into this conversation. So much so that there are some scholars who look at this and think, this isn't Paul. Like this isn't the way Paul normally talks. So much that they think, maybe Luke is taking somebody else's sermon and ascribing it to Paul. But the reality, this is Paul going out of his comfort zone and also developing in how he communicates the gospel message of Christ because of his knowledge and his experience with these philosophers. And so there is a sense of Paul's even growth and change because of his interactions, that he was able to understand maybe the gospel from a new perspective because of his interactions with these philosophies.
The troubling thing, however, is, and you're absolutely right in the sense that you can pluck verse 24 through 28 out of the section and place it and pen the composition and offer credit to Aristotle, and people would not know the difference. The connections that you have, for example, between this and Nicomachean ethics, it's incredible. But what you consider and what you, Joey, just defined as Paul's growth, other people in the church in Jerusalem may call the watering down of the gospel. People in the synagogue that Paul has just left may call this the watering down of Judaism. And so I think that sometimes when it comes to the rest of the people that you as a viewer have around, when you're asking the questions, how do I integrate these ideas, this language, these approaches that'll make me connect in more meaningful ways with other people? Sometimes we get very nervous about that, and we immediately start saying, well, no, you're watering down truth, or you're watering down the message, or you're another word that we love using is you're compromising. And so I think this particular section, as I read it and reread it and looked at it and kind of parsed it out, it gave me a lot of hope, because often When we have our credentials challenged as a faithful follower or as a member of this particular group because we're compromising or we're quote unquote watering down, I see a lot of that same effort done here in Paul. Paul is not watering down.
Mhm.
Paul is trying to connect with.
Yeah, that's so powerful. Yeah. So, and then the inevitable question that arises is that how do you know if you are being unduly influenced by these interactions away from where God is leading you, or if you are actually learning and growing to understand God in a greater way? Like, how do you know which direction you're going, right? And I think at the core, and I'd love to hear what you have to say too. I think for me, at the core of that is, what is it that's leading us to be more like Jesus, right? To to see the world the way that Jesus does and to live in this world the way that Jesus does. What is it that's drawing us to do that? To love God more fully and love others more completely. And if that has now become more of my benchmark, because it's the benchmark that Jesus identified, right? That it's the identifying mark of a Christian to that his disciples will be known by their love in John chapter 13, that the greatest commandments are to love God with all our heart, all our mind, all our soul, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. So this aspect, especially as found in the book of John, but throughout the Gospels and the New Testament, is this idea that if we are growing more in love with God and growing more in love with the people around us, then then we know that we are at least heading in the right direction. We may not be at the right place yet, but we know that we are heading in the right direction. So for me, that becomes sort of a benchmark to make sure that that I am not being led off track or straight, because I see that as being a fear. Like, if I interact with people who believe things differently than I do, and then I'm influenced by them, how do I know that I'm not being led astray from God? Right.
And how do you incorporate? It's not just that you're meeting with people, it's that you're actively incorporating their language that they're comfortable with,
Yeah.
ideas that they're comfortable with, ideas actually that were theirs before they were yours.
Yeah.
These philosophers predate Jesus.
Yeah.
And so how do you know if you're not being influenced by them? And I think the benchmark of love is a great benchmark. But I also think that the heart is deceitful. And we have the capacity of justifying and convincing ourselves of a lot of things. Um, so I'm going to try to be as candid as possible, and I'm going to invite you to take a leap of faith. The reality is, you don't know. You don't know. But at some point, you have to trust that God is actually working in the world. God said he was. Some days you wake up and you look at the world around you and you say, how can it be possible to say that God is active and present in this world with all the stuff that is going on? And yet, at night when you go to bed, you pray to God and you say, thank you. Thank you for this day. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for your continued care. So we are able to do this. The thing then is, what if God isn't just working on the world in an abstract way? What if God is working upon his creation in very concrete ways? And what if God isn't just working in the church? And we've said this before. What if God is working in the ideological frameworks that are out there? We get really good at pointing out the faults that the Areopagus has, and to be sure, there are faults. There are faults in Athens, Athens doesn't have it completely right. But I think we also need to recognize with that same vehemency that God is working in Athens because God is at work everywhere. And so at some point, I think, not only do you have to ask the introspective question of am I really doing this because I love people and I'm falling more in love with God, but at some point you also have to say, do I trust that God is great enough to be working not just in Jerusalem, because there's problems in the church as well. Mm-hmm. It's not like the church had it all figured out.
No.
And in the same way that in spite of the issues in the church, we believe that God is working in the church, could we say that in spite of all of the issues, and there's many to be sure, that are happening in Athens, God is at work there?
Yeah, that God is at work, not just in Abraham, but in Melchizedek, right? Mm. Or God is at work, not just in Moses and the Israelites, but also Jethro, mm-hmm. right? That there are people outside of the community that we identify with where God is still mm-hmm. at work, and perhaps we can learn from them as well. That's so powerful. I also think that this idea of the people of God, or God himself co-opting the language of other people and using the language that they've already created mm-hmm. is nothing new. I mean, Paul does that here, right? Mm-hmm. With the unknown God, he uses the language of philosophers here to describe God. He's not doing something new. God did that not just with language, but even practices, where he takes circumcision, mm-hmm. something that other peoples practiced, and then he infused meaning into mm-hmm. it, right? He takes baptism, which the larger Jewish nation practiced as well, not specifically the way that John the Baptist does or Jesus does, but this idea of a purification ritual was something that other people did as well. And then he infuses new meaning into it. He takes the Passover and then infuses. So all of these things, God seems to be comfortable with taking the language, even language of a philosophy that he may not completely agree with, and then co-opting it for his own usage. And so I do think that sometimes in our day and age, where words have we've had to become so precise with words, right? Especially in our very politically correct world. Some of that can be very good because words can do damage and harm. But I don't think that if we are using those words in helpful ways, that they are things that we need to be afraid of. Because God has also used words of different groups and different philosophies and used it to communicate his good news message as well.
And this is, I think, why we need to start engaging in more thoughtful conversations within the church on what is truth. This is asked. Nicodemus asks this of Jesus in John. What is true? And we've often, or traditionally, because we come from a Western mindset, we've said that truth is a set of beliefs that you possess and that then you can act upon. That is truth. Truth is an ideology that has been tested and proven and is functional and useful. But I think that what Jesus points to in the conversation he has in Nicodemus, and what John and what Paul is alluding to here, is that truth maybe is less of a set of beliefs that you possess and more of an experience that you participate in. And because truth is an experiencing, and I love an experience you participate in with partners, to use some of the language that you shared a minute ago, truth doesn't cease to be truth if somebody that we disagrees says it. Truth is still truth because it's this experience that we are partnering in and participating in. So just because somebody with whom we completely disagree on 99% of things says something true, then that is true, regardless of if we agree with the rest of the ideology. We need to be mature enough to realize that agreeing with someone on something that is true does not mean that we carte blanche agree with everything that this person
That's a good
stands
point.
for.
Yeah.
Black Lives Matter. There, I said it. Black Lives Matter. That's true. Whether you agree with all of the other implications of that particular movement, then that's a decision that you have to make. But I think that the fact that something is true, or that a statement is true, and you can assent to that statement, doesn't mean that now you need to agree with everything else. Paul says, hey, I see you're religious, love your statue of the unknown God, adore the fact that you believe you guys are offsprings of God. You've even said it. It's fantastic. God doesn't live in temples. Agree with everything. Does that mean that Paul wholeheartedly endorses the whole of Stoic or Epicurean philosophy?
No.
Of course not. And so now let's have the same certainty about the thing. I think we are so uncomfortable, and I'm going to get off my soapbox in 10 seconds. I think we are so uncomfortable with what you just said, which was, hey, we language, and do we dare appropriate this language? I think we're uncomfortable with that, not because we fear that we are going to be influenced by that language, but because we are unsure of what we believe ourselves. And when we are unsure of what we believe as truth ourselves, of course, we are going to be unmoored by everything. But let's just, for a moment, recognize that truth is truth, regardless if it's Epicurean, Stoic, or any other person with whom you disagree.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I love what you're saying here. We don't have to agree with everything to agree on some things, right? And that we almost have this fear that if we assent to agreeing with one point, that we have to accept all of it, or that means I'm letting them win.
That's
as
right.
if it's some kind of contest. And yet Paul is showing here very clearly that it's okay that this kind of reaching people who come from a different perspective than we do, actually reaching them means making a bridge of connection. And that starts with understanding and a willingness to understand in a way that I open the door to my own understanding being transformed by theirs, right? Because some of what they say may be true, just like some of what I say may be true. Like, I'm opening that door to understand where they're coming from, finding common ground that we can agree on, and then moving on to sharing our broader perspective. Right. And that is part of it. We're not just saying that you stop with the common ground and then you end it there, because I think that sometimes that is also the fear, like, oh, we're just going to build common ground and then nobody's going to be no, we are supposed to challenge each other, to help each other grow, right? As Proverbs says, iron sharpens iron. There is this aspect of growing, but you can't start by immediately being abrasive. Otherwise, there's no connection. There has to be a meeting of the minds before any kind of growth and challenge and change can happen. So that challenge has to come, but that's not step one. That's later on in the process, as Paul demonstrates here.
And that later on in the process might take a lot of listening, a lot of experiencing life together, a lot of creating and building trust, diffusing some of the anger, so that we can say, yeah, we want to Black Lives Matter, and we also want to make America great again, to use really, really loaded slogans that we are all very familiar with. I think the last thing I would say is that just because you do everything right, so suppose you follow this whole idea where you are able to appropriate language, and you're able to speak meaningfully into culture, and you are grounded enough in your beliefs that you allow truth to be truth. and not something that is up for your possession. You might still do everything right, and the results might not be what you're expecting.
Yeah.
And that's okay. I think that probably is the most encouraging thing about this whole story, right? That at the end there's like 3 people that say, okay, we'll follow you, Paul. So I think sometimes we think that there's something wrong with the system or with the approach if we're not getting the results that we desired. And this is a great story that reminds us that even if you do everything just right, sometimes the results aren't going to be what you expected, and then that's okay. You need to be kind with yourself.
Because we don't know fully what God's ultimate goal was in those conversations either, right? We don't know if we're at the beginning planting a seed that's going to sprout later. We don't know if we are just one part of their journey that God is leading them. We have no idea. But what we do know is that we can be faithful to that journey by following this pattern that Paul sets out for us.
Yeah, back to this idea of having trust that God is working in the world, sometimes in spite of us. Joey, pray for us as we conclude.
Our good and gracious God, we want to thank you so much for being a God who seeks to understand us. I mean, you're the God who knows everything, and yet you came and put on human flesh. You became human, fully divine, fully human in this world. Not only that you can save it, but also to make a connection with us in ways that we would not be able to if you had not condescended to become like us. And so we ask that you help us to be incarnational in our approach to each other as well, is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
So one thing we know is true, and that is that we'll see you next week, Sabbath, 10:30. Have a wonderful week and a very, very happy holiday season.